COVID fraud is rapidly evolving. The Health and Human Services Department saying scammers are now setting up fake vaccine websites, asking people for money or personal information. So how do you know a scam when you see one? NBC News investigative correspondent Vicki Nguyen has some tips.
My 95-year-old grandmother, I couldn't figure out how to get her appointment. It was making me crazy, so I took to the internet.
I got my first shot by TurboVax.
Citizen-led sites like TurboVax posting available appointments in New York City, while websites like vaccinehunter.org connect people to social groups for how to score leftover shots. Some sites sending you texts or email alerts about availability and when it's your turn. Countless people crediting vaccine websites and social media for helping them secure a shot.
We wanted to build something to help everyone navigate this process in a much easier way.
While these sites and resources can be helpful, officials say be careful.
When you have a lot of non-standard processes, it's an area ripe for fraudsters to exploit.
Nanette Day is an assistant special agent in charge with the Department of Health and Human Services. How big of a concern is this for you?
We're already seeing complaints coming in where people are being charged even to make an appointment for the vaccine. There is no legitimate process that requires you to pay for the vaccine or to pay for a spot in order to get the vaccine.
Her office, along with other government agencies, have already looked into more than 96,000 potentially malicious COVID-19 websites. Like this one, spoofing vaccine maker Moderna's website, allegedly selling vaccines. At a quick glance, it seems like the real deal. But look closely and you can see Moderna is spelled wrong. The website has been disabled. The biggest concern? Social media and messages that appear to come from people you know.
Here's how a scheme could go. I get a contact from a friend of mine who I don't realize their account has been hacked. And this friend says, hey, I was able to get a leftover vaccine. I just had to pay $200 to this guy. Contact him and give him your information.
Day says any unsolicited contact could be a red flag, so call and confirm in real life.
Signing up for a vaccine does require some personal information to be entered. What are some pieces of information you should never be entering on a website to secure a vaccine?
You should never be entering your credit card. That's the very first thing. You shouldn't be ever entering things like what's your mother's maiden name, those types of security question information. And you shouldn't be giving your Social Security account number either.
Another tip, make sure the web address doesn't have a dot with two letters at the very end, like .me. That's Montenegro.
We've already seen domains from other countries coming in saying that they're registering people for vaccination appointments in the United States.
And that's not true.
That's not true.
Depending on how you signed up, don't click on links in texts or in emails. Instead, go to the websites themselves and steer clear of anyone asking you to make an appointment for a medical exam to get the vaccine. Tips to get you vaccinated the right way and keep your personal information safe.
Hey everyone, I'm Allison Morris. You are watching NBC News Now. The Derek Chauvin murder trial starting today with witness testimony from 911 dispatcher Jenna Scurry, who said she called the police as she watched George Floyd's arrest.
But in your experience, you felt something was wrong here that a sergeant needed to know about.
Correct. If this was a form of use of force, I was calling to let them know.
Chauvin is charged with second and third degree murder as well as second degree manslaughter. His lawyer says he used necessary force, adding that the growing crowd of bystanders at the scene diverted officers' attention from the care of George Floyd and to the threat that was growing in front of them.
As the crowd grew in size, seemingly so too did their anger. And remember, there's more to the scene than just what the officers see in front of them. There are people behind them. There are people across the street. There are cars stopping, people yelling. There is a growing crowd and what officers perceive to be a threat.
The prosecutors say that Chauvin deliberately used excessive and unreasonable force against a defenseless George Floyd.
We're going to prove to you that Mr. Chauvin's conduct was a substantial cause of Mr. Floyd's death. We've charged him with murder in the second degree, murder in the third degree, and manslaughter for using excessive force against George Floyd. We're going to show you that putting knees on somebody's neck Mr. Floyd's, putting a knee on his back for 9 minutes and 29 seconds was an eminently dangerous activity. And he did it without regard to what impact it had on Mr. Floyd's life.
Evidence will show that Mr. Floyd died of a cardiac arrhythmia that occurred as a result of hypertension, his coronary disease, the ingestion of methamphetamine and fentanyl, and the adrenaline flowing through his body. There was no evidence that Mr. Floyd's airflow was restricted, and he did not determine to be a positional or mechanical asphyxia death.
What did you think about this when you look back and saw that it hadn't changed?
I first asked if the screens had frozen.
Why did you ask that?
Because it hadn't changed.
Okay. And did you find that it had frozen?
No.
How did you know?
I was told that it was not frozen.
Did you see the screen change yourself?
Yes, I saw the person's moving.
So what did you start thinking at that point?
Something might be wrong. My instincts were telling me that something's wrong. Something is not right.
And what did you decide to do?
I took that instinct and I called the sergeant.
And do you recall who the sergeant was that you talked to?
It was Sergeant Kluger.
I didn't know. You can call me a snitch if you want to, but we have the cameras up for 320's call. Oh, did they already put him in the... They must have already started moving him. And 320 over at Cup Foods.
Okay.
I don't know if they had used force or not. They got something out of the back of the squad, and all of them sat on this man. So I don't know if they needed you or not, but they haven't said anything to me yet.
Yeah, they haven't said anything unless it was just a takedown, which doesn't count, but
okay.
I'll find out.
No problem. We don't get to ever see it, so when we see it, we're just like, well.
You said that the majority of your job is done by listening. Can you explain what you mean by that?
We are in a room with no windows. We work off of a phone and a radio. The majority of our time. The other times would be only if we had some kind of video to show us, anything like that. Then other than that, we are always on a phone or radio.
Okay. Having been questioned by opposing counsel about your call, as you sit here today, have you changed your mind about the reasons why you called Sergeant Kluger when you did?
No.
Let's bring in MSNBC anchor Ali Velshi from Minneapolis. Ali, both sides questioning the 911 dispatcher today before moving on to a second witness. Who else did the prosecution call to the stand? And what can you tell us about their first few witnesses today?
So we've had three now. There's a third witness on the stand currently. They're about to wrap up for the day. You had the 911 dispatcher who provided a great amount of detail about who was dispatched to the scene, and the remarkable detail that mostly they listened, but she had some video images, and she noticed something that didn't feel right. Instinctively, she thought something was wrong, so she informed a sergeant. That is not normally how things happen. So that was the first witness. The second witness was someone who worked in the gas station directly across from Cup Foods, who had also taken some of the important video that described what happened. Most of the video that people have seen, you'll remember, is on the other side of a police car. So it's from the perspective of passersby on the sidewalk. George Floyd and the three police officers who are on him are on the other side of a police car. This woman worked in a gas station, which had a very clear view of those three officers on George Floyd. So she testified as to what she recorded and what she saw. And then finally, they brought on one of the people who had been a passerby who had seen what had happened. But the interesting thing about this piece of testimony that's underway right now, this witness, is he happens to be an expert in jiu-jitsu and mixed martial arts and understands chokeholds, how to cause them, how to get someone to submit, how to avoid cutting off someone's blood flow or airflow. And he's getting into a great deal of detail about chokeholds, and that's where they are right now, because the defense, as you played, is making the argument that the asphyxiation, the end of life for George Floyd was not a result of Derek Chauvin kneeling on his neck. It was because of underlying conditions. They're now hearing from a witness who just happened to be a passerby, who's an expert on chokeholds, and is describing what he has learned over the years about choking people. So that's where we are right now.
What a fascinating witness to call. Ali, that's what's going on inside the courtroom. Outside the courtroom, we know that emotions in Minneapolis are really running high. You spoke with some members of the Black community in Minneapolis about this trial over the weekend. What did you hear from them?
Yeah, so, the prosecution's case is there's a lot of video. What you see in the video is actually what happened. The defense is arguing there's a lot more to it than what's in the video, than the 9 minutes and 29 seconds. So for a whole lot of people I spoke to, they think, as George Floyd's brother has said, that this is a slam dunk case. So I asked the people I spoke with this weekend, what happens if this case does not result in a conviction? Here's what they told me. What happens if there isn't a conviction?
I can't let myself think about that. I started to, and I just started crying. I mean, one of the biggest differences between this case and so many other cases of police brutality is this was not a shooting. This was 9 minutes of a man with a smug look on his face and his hands in his pockets, kneeling on another man's neck. He wouldn't have done that to a dog in the street.
I don't want to imagine it. I'm trying to keep hopeful for my students, for my community. I think that when I let my mind get there and think about that reality of no conviction, I think of the community that has been continuously hurt for so long, hurting yet again.
What would happen is black people, first of all, won't be surprised if he's not convicted, because we've seen it time and time again throughout history. And the question should be then, what do we as a society do about it? What do we as humanity do about it? The white community should be able to stand up now and say, okay, seriously, we see you black people, we saw that for 9 minutes, and now we are going to ensure this never happens again.
We've seen the evidence. The world has seen literally the evidence for it. And so for there not to be a conviction would be injustice toward, of course, the family, the community. I believe it would be an injustice toward God. I believe that God would be grieved by this, and that we would, as a country, face a reckoning with that reality.
And, while this was a group of 6 people here in Minneapolis, Allison, I've been having conversations about this with people across the country, and what you heard there was very reflective of what a lot of people think, particularly a lot of black people in this country.
Allie, thank you so much for having those important conversations. Great to have them on our air today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Fran.
Let's go to NBC News contributor and former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance. She is also a professor at the University of Alabama School of Law and former criminal defense attorney and adjunct lecturer in law at Columbia University, Caroline Polisi. Joyce, I'll start with you. Derek Chauvin has pleaded not guilty to all of the charges against him, but can you walk us through the differences between second-degree murder, manslaughter, and then this newest charge that was added on here, third-degree murder?
Sure. So the complaint against Derek Chauvin, as you point out, has 3 charges. The first one is a murder 2 charge. This is under Minnesota law. State law can be wildly different across the 50 states. But here, this is what prosecutors call a felony murder charge. It means that there was a death during the commission of another felony. Here, prosecutors have suggested that there was a 3rd-degree assault. And that's one type of murder. The second charge is a murder 3, and this is a depraved heart or a depraved mind murder, as they call it in Minnesota. The charge here surrounds elements prosecutors have to prove that establish that the defendant acted with such reckless disregard for human life that disregard, that callousness, is tantamount to proof of intent, so that the defendant can be convicted of murder. And then finally, there's a manslaughter charge. It's a little bit of a step down from that murder 3 charge. It's negligence. The prosecution has to show that the defendant created a dangerous situation and then acted with consciousness that death or serious injury could result, but nonetheless went ahead. So what separates these 3 different charges is the level of intent prosecutors have to prove, the defendant's state of mind. For all 3 of those charges, though, prosecutors will have to prove what's likely to be the most contentious issue in this trial, and that's the cause of death, with the defense suggesting that it was something other than Derek Chauvin's knee on George Floyd's neck.
Joyce, we heard opening statements from both sides today. The prosecution managing to bring up 3 witnesses today. They're currently talking to the third as they prepare to wrap for the day. The first witness of the day was the 911 dispatcher, and she testified that Chauvin was on George Floyd's neck for so long that she thought her screen froze while she was watching the live police camera feed. Here's more of what she said.
You used the term snitch.
Yes.
What did you mean by that?
At that moment, it was a word that just came out of my mouth, but it's out of the scope of my duties to call a sergeant if there was any use of force.
And so that's what the purpose, well, tell me, what was the purpose of making that call to him and giving him that information?
Voicing my concerns.
Joyce, why do you think prosecutors called this witness first, and what else was remarkable to you about her particular testimony?
You know, prosecutors don't get to argue the evidence in their opening statements. They can lay out what they expect to prove, but they can't argue about what it means. And as they begin to put on witnesses, they have that same limitation. They can't argue, they can't tell the jury what the evidence means. They're essentially on a treasure hunt, sort of picking up these little gems that they'll be able to use later on in closing argument where they put the case together for the jury. And this testimony that you've just played, it's one of those gems. This is a 911 dispatcher who does something that she's never done before because of what she sees. She calls the sergeant, and in a polite, professional way, she alerts him to the fact that there's a problem. This is the sort of cumulative evidence that the prosecution will use in closing argument to prove that what was going on wasn't within normal police behavior, and that it in fact demonstrated the sort of depraved mind, the reckless indifference to human life that prosecutors have to convince the jury existed in order to obtain a conviction.
Caroline, we also heard today from a shift leader at the Speedway across the street from where George Floyd died. She said she was nervous being on the stand. How can the defense use something like that to their advantage?
Well, she was clearly nervous to be on the stand. I think it was a unique choice in the first witness for the prosecution. I don't think there's any more to the story here than simply the prosecutors laying the foundation to use that videotape evidence as evidence so that the jurors can watch it. Apparently, this is the bulk of the video evidence was taken by this first witness. So they're really just getting things in order for their case here. The defense is going to have an uphill battle every step of the way because there is such strong video evidence. Jurors love video evidence. And the fact is they have an uphill battle. They're making a water isn't wet argument here with respect to what Joyce alluded to, the causation. They are actually arguing that it wasn't the knee to the neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds that caused George Floyd's death. Instead, they're trying to distract, really, and they're bringing in evidence of prior bad acts. They're saying the level of fentanyl in his system was lethal. He had methamphetamines in there. He had an undiagnosed heart problem. However, the problem is, those all may have been contributory factors, but the law in Minnesota doesn't require that it be the only factor, that Derek Chauvin be the only factor, just that it was a standard, a big factor, as it were. And so, that's a really hard thing to prove in the face of such strong video evidence.
Caroline, Chauvin's attorney also making the argument that the crowd of bystanders at the scene distracted officers from caring for Floyd and that those officers believed that the crowd posed a threat. Could you talk to us about the defense's approach here? What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think this is just another example of the defense really grasping at straws. It might sound like an okay argument to you and me if we hadn't seen the video. The problem, again, is that we see the video. We see clearly the 3 officers sitting on George Floyd. Maybe one of the officers was distracted talking to the crowd. But if anything, the crowd was sounding the alarm. The crowd were the people that were saying, hey, wait a minute, something's not right here. This is not appropriate, what's happening. And so, that argument, again, I think really undermines the defense's credibility because it is so clearly a bad argument to make. Mm-hmm. Out of the get-go, the jury is probably asking themselves, this defense has no case.
Right. It's only the first day of this trial. I know we will have much more to discuss. Joyce, Caroline, thanks for being with us. I hope you'll join us again. All right, let's go to NBC News now. Correspondent Simone Boyce. She has the latest headlines from NBCnews.com. Hi, Simone.
Hey, Allison, we start in the United Kingdom, where some people are rejoicing because England has begun a huge rollback of coronavirus restrictions. The country is seeing infection rates fall significantly after a 3-month lockdown and vaccination efforts. With people gathering again at parks and beaches, locals are calling today Happy Monday. And former President Barack Obama's grandmother passed away today in Nairobi. Mama Sarah, as she was known, was at least 99 years old and promoted education for girls and orphans. Obama tweeting, "We will miss her dearly, but will celebrate with gratitude her long and remarkable life." Well, a committee in Johnson County, Kansas, is looking into changing a stream's racially charged name. They are studying the history of Negro Creek. That's actually what it's called, after activists petitioned last summer to remove it. The advocates behind the efforts hope this leads to renaming other Kansas locations as well. And Visa piloting a program to use cryptocurrency for payment settlements. It will use USD coin, a stable coin whose value is pegged directly to the US dollar. The move comes as more mainstream finance firms take steps to allow cryptocurrencies for investment and payments. And some additional help on the way for renters who have had trouble paying their rent during the pandemic. The CDC extending the national eviction moratorium, now in effect through June 30th. But before the announcement, the eviction ban was set to expire in just 2 days. Allison, that'll do it for me. Back to you.
All right, Simone, thank you. 90% of adults in America will be eligible for the COVID vaccine by April 19th. They will also have a vaccination site within 5 miles of their home by then. President Biden making that announcement at the White House this afternoon. NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli joining me now. Mike, the president giving an update on the White House's response to COVID and how we're doing with vaccines across America. What else did he have to say today?
Well, Allison, this is the White House. This is an administration that I would say has a sort of complicated relationship when it comes to good news. Remember, it was just a couple days ago, we were all talking about the fact that in the president's first major news conference, he wasn't even asked about the coronavirus, which was attributed to the sense among the public, really, that the worst is behind us. But now what we're seeing is even as the administration has been quick to announce good news about the ability of Americans to get vaccinated, about the supply of vaccinations, about new vaccines coming online, it might be contributing in some ways to the sense that this is behind us more than it really is. That's why we had so many officials today sounding the alarm. The CDC director, Rochelle Walensky, talking about the sense of impending doom that she feels as she sees case numbers beginning to rise. And so even as President Biden today was talking about what he thought was good news on the vaccine supply and the ability of Americans to get vaccinated, he was balancing it with a little bit of straight talk as well. So take a listen to that balancing act, what we heard this afternoon.
As many people as we vaccinated, we still have more Americans left to go. You know, we will administer more shots in March than any country on earth. But even so, we have to give more shots in April than we did in March, because we're in the life and death race with the virus that is spreading quickly.
As multiple administration officials said today, this is a race between the pandemic and some of those variants, but also the vaccine. And that's why they're trying to get as many people vaccinated as quickly as possible. Rochelle Walensky, the CDC director, also saying when she has her weekly call with some of the nation's governors tomorrow, she's going to be bringing the message not to open up so quickly. Some of those states that have moved more aggressively than others may be contributing, in her view, to some of these spiking case levels we're seeing nationwide.
Mike, the White House also previewing its infrastructure plan today. Jen Psaki talking about that at her press briefing. What did she have to say?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yesterday, I asked President Biden, I was traveling with him on his way back from Delaware, if he had settled on a legislative strategy about, remember, it's the Build Back Better agenda, multiple parts to it, a part of what they would see as the recovery aspect of his economic plan versus the rescue component, which they've already been talking about now. He said he had a strategy, but he didn't want to share it just yet. But we are hearing from Jen Psaki a little bit more about it. The first priority, infrastructure, and then down the road, they're going to be talking a little bit more about healthcare and caregiving. But take a listen to what Jen Psaki said today about the next steps for this administration.
The president has an ambitious goal. The most important thing is to figure out how to put forward the investments that are much needed in our infrastructure. What's irresponsible is not to address the urgent needs of that investment, but the means and mechanisms of paying for it. We look forward to presenting his plans, but also hearing proposals for others who may have a difference of view.
So, Alison, we know President Biden is going to be talking about his infrastructure plan later this week in Pittsburgh. But one of the big questions is what Jen Psaki was being pressed on today. Just how detailed will this speech be? Will he get into how it's all going to be paid for? Remember, Democrats writ large have been talking about infrastructure as more than just brick and mortar roads and bridges, those kinds of projects, but also to be included things like expanding broadband access and what Kamala Harris was talking about just last week, the human infrastructure, things like tax credits for childcare and the like. So a lot of questions still out there about what's going to be in this and how they're going to pay for it.
Yeah, a lot of questions. The biggest one, as you mentioned, how are they going to pay for it? I know that always seems to be the headline when it comes to plans like this. Mike, one more question for you. The Associated Press reporting today that SolarWinds hackers got access to the former DHS secretary's email accounts. The question really now, how the U.S. government can protect individuals, companies, and institutions if it can't protect itself. What else do we know about this?
Yeah, the administration we're expecting two big announcements as it relates to the SolarWinds hack based on what officials were telling us just in the last few days. One, of course, is the sanctions that the administration will impose on Russia. Remember, the Biden administration is considering sanctions and having different reviews about different components of Russia's malign behavior, including what they've already done, the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. We've seen sanctions from the administration on that. We expect more on election interference. But yes, this SolarWinds hack is a big one, and that's going to be what we expect first. But also the administration saying they need to make a major investment in technology for the federal government. I've heard this from White House officials as they moved from the campaign to the administration that all of the tools that they use are much worse technology and much more susceptible to hacks. So we should expect to hear more from the administration about ways they can do this and protect the government infrastructure from these kinds of hacks.
All right, Mike Memoli, always a pleasure to see you, sir. Thank you.
See you.
First, it was the November election, then the January runoffs. Here we are in March of 2021, and Georgia voters are getting national attention once again, this time for a restrictive new voting measure the governor signed into law last week. NBC News correspondent Blaine Alexander is in Atlanta with a closer look at the changes and the controversy.
Well, Alison, this new law here in Georgia has not even been on the books for 96 hours already. There are several groups that have filed lawsuits to try and strike it down. Now, some Republicans are pointing to this as an example for other states to potentially follow. But many Democrats, including President Biden, are calling it out as blatant voter suppression.
We can't win! With the historic 2020 election barely in the rearview mirror, Georgia is facing a new battle over the ballot.
It's just another way to keep us from turning our vote in.
In Atlanta and around the country, Georgia's new voting law, passed by the Republican-led state legislature, is facing major backlash. Among the changes, enforcing new ID requirements for mail-in ballots, limiting the use of ballot drop boxes, and making it illegal to approach voters in line to offer food or water. Republicans say the changes make elections more secure and allow many counties to expand early in-person voting. But critics say the changes amount to voter suppression, saying the law specifically targets black voters who turned out in record numbers for the 2020 election. The National Black Justice Coalition is calling on the famed Masters Tournament to pull out of the Peach State, writing in part, professional golf should not reward Georgia's attacks on democracy and voting rights with the millions of dollars in revenue that the tournament generates. Neither Augusta National, which hosts the major, nor the PGA Tour has publicly commented on the request. The head of the Major League Baseball Players Association is also adding pressure, telling the Boston Globe that players want to discuss moving this summer's All-Star game out of Atlanta. Meanwhile, President Biden is calling the law Jim Crow in the 21st century and vowing that his Justice Department will take a look. Georgia's governor is firing back.
Simply find out what's in the bill versus just the blank statement of this is Jim Crow or, this is voter suppression or this is racist, because it is not.
As Governor Kemp signed the bill last week, Georgia State Representative Park Cannon was arrested for knocking on his door in the state capitol.
No, what are you doing?
Police charged her with obstructing officials and interrupting the assembly. Cannon, now out of jail, is vowing to return to work today.
And Allison, we are hearing from a number of people about that state representative's arrest, including Senator Raphael Warnock. He actually went to the jail after she was arrested late last week. Now, incidentally, he and other Washington lawmakers are gearing up for their own battle over voting rights. And he says what's happening here in Georgia is only giving him more fuel to get that bill passed. Allison.
Is there room in Congress for a bipartisan compromise on gun control? Even with the House and the Senate out on recess this week, there are some signs of hope. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Leanne Caldwell has more.
Hey, Allison. The Senate left town without doing anything on guns, but that doesn't mean that they aren't working on it. Let's look at what was said over the weekend on the Sunday shows when one Democrat and one Republican both said on Meet the Press that they think there could be some bipartisan action on guns, specifically the issue of background checks, expanding those background checks to all commercial cells. Well, the reason there might be some light in this very, very dark tunnel on this very complicated issue is that previously Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer had said he was going to plow ahead on this issue of guns, put two pieces of legislation that the House passed on the Senate floor, watch them fail, but put people on the record. Well, that strategy has seemed to change. Senator Schumer has said that he is willing to slow down and work with Republicans on the issue, in giving some insight that perhaps there is room to find those 60 votes needed in the Senate to pass something. Congress is out for 2 weeks. Things are happening. Talks are going on behind the scenes, but it looks like Congress has a little bit of appetite to perhaps get something done. The question is, how bold and big do Democrats want to go? The other question is, how far are Republicans willing to go before these talks completely break down? Allison.
Parts of the South cleaning up from devastating storms that killed at least 4 people over the weekend, and now they are bracing for round 2. The hardest hit area, Nashville, Tennessee, where extreme flooding drove much of the city underwater, and more rain is in the forecast for tomorrow. NBC News correspondent Morgan Chesky is in the Music City.
Frightening new video of deadly floodwaters in Tennessee. In Nashville, more than 7 inches of rain in 48 hours sent rivers raging, swallowing streets, school buses, and catching many off guard. Among them, a police officer, water sweeping his cruiser right off the road.
He was able to get out of his car. He was clinging to a tree for safety till he was rescued.
Fire crews making at least 130 high water rescues, saving people trapped in cars, homes, and apartments. Those first responders also pulling 40 pets to safety. The intense rain, one of the wettest 24-hour periods in Nashville's history, marking the city's worst flooding since 2010, when 21 people died. The view from above, even more stark. Parking lots turned ponds near evacuated neighborhoods.
The water got up into all the structures, the homes. We have about 50 houses that were affected.
Hundreds trying to salvage whatever they can. Andy Benedict helping every neighbor he could find.
You know, we're just cleaning up things that were carried away by the water. It's just an all hands on deck, massive cleanup effort.
In Arkansas, the same storm system spawned not 1, but 2 tornadoes. The National Weather Service saying damage indicates winds topped 120 miles an hour. And in Georgia, the added rain only dampened recovery efforts from the massive EF4 twister that tore through the town of Noonan. Back here in Tennessee, the big question, when will Mother Nature finally let up?
You know, it's mostly things that are damaged and ruined, and as long as it's just things, then the community will rally around those people in need, and we'll make it right through.
COVID-induced psychosis. It is extremely rare, but a small number of patients are going through it. NBC News Now correspondent Maura Barrett has their story.
Yeah, this is the last photo that we have of Ben. He had just got out of the hospital that day, finally got home and got to snuggle with his boy.
Ben Price was a husband, father of two, business owner, and a farmer. He juggled it all with what his family called a boisterous energy.
Just a larger-than-life person, extremely outgoing, very intentional in all of his relationships.
More than 1 million people have been hospitalized with COVID-19. But when Ben returned home after treatment, he wasn't the same person.
What stood out to you specifically when he came home? I would be holding his hand and he'd be like, I'm just so scared. I'm so scared. And I would be like, what are you scared about? What is it? And he couldn't even really pinpoint what it was, but he just was very panicked and just not himself. He was pacing the house and going from window to window and just was really nervous about things that just weren't even an issue. He was anxious and panicked, but at the time, we just, COVID brain fog.
He was prescribed anti-anxiety medication, but just days after Ben came home, he took his own life. Jennifer is now looking into a new phenomenon doctors are calling COVID psychosis, a rare but real case for an estimated 1 to 4% of patients.
There is an emerging pattern, and the pattern seems to be a pretty marked change in a person who may not have had psychiatric problems before, and a set of emotional symptoms like distress, along with, impaired sense of reality. We call that psychosis, hence the term COVID psychosis.
A similar thing was seen during the 1918 Spanish flu, a virus infiltrating the brain, resulting in neurological symptoms.
We are looking at a relatively new set of problems, but we've always known that viruses can trigger changes in the brain that can lead to things like COVID psychosis.
So when you say trigger things in the brain, that's different than just a reaction of someone's trauma or experience dealing with the virus. It's an actual potential change in the brain because of the virus.
The simple story is yes.
Currently, there's little data about COVID psychosis, though new studies are starting to emerge, which may help doctors identify symptoms.
So if your COVID recovery is going well, but some other symptom is getting worse, well, that doesn't make sense. Things like if a person stops sleeping, that's unusual. If they stop eating, if they stop enjoying things that they used to enjoy, and, of course, if they're saying things that they usually wouldn't say. Those would be all reasons, to talk to them, call your primary care doctor right away.
It's impossible to know what Ben had, whether it was COVID psychosis, depression caused by his hospital stay, or otherwise. But family and friends believe this situation was a result of the disease.
It had to be linked to COVID. There was no question in our minds about that. There was no way. He loved life so much.
A lot of times we would talk and he would say, God, Eric, we are so lucky. We have great families, we have great kids, we have great wives.
If you had known what you know now, what would you have done differently?
I would have known that his behavior was more than just fog, and would have gotten him to the Mayo Clinic or somewhere that was already looking at the neurological effects of COVID, and just shown up on the doorstep and said, we're here, we need to see someone. I wouldn't have let him out of my sight because I would have known that he was unpredictable because of more than just having some COVID brain fog.
Jennifer says now she's working to spread awareness via the Illinois governor's office and even the White House to prevent other families from going through what hers did.
Losing my husband, losing a dad this way is so devastating.
What do you think? You think Daddy's gonna talk to you? Do you think gonna talk to you? Huh?
It brings some comfort just knowing that it was beyond him and he didn't leave us, but COVID took him from us.
Impending doom. CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky sending a warning at today's White House COVID briefing with cases and deaths on the rise across the country.
Right now, I'm scared. I know what it's like as a physician to stand in that patient room, gowned, gloved, masked, shielded, and to be the last person to touch someone else's loved one because their loved one couldn't be there. I know what it's like when you're the physician, when you're the healthcare provider, and you're worried that you don't have the resources to take care of the patients in front of you.
Let's bring in NBC News senior medical correspondent Dr. John Torres. Dr. John, Dr. Walensky, fighting back tears there. She is deeply concerned about a potential fourth surge of COVID-19. What do you think when you look at where cases, hospitalizations, and deaths are going in this country?
And Allison, I think that myself, along with a lot of other medical people around the country, a lot of public health officials, a lot of political officials, and just people in the country are looking at this, getting a bit disheartened, saying, okay, we've been through this before. History is repeating itself. And if you look at the numbers, and that's the perfect chart to put up there, April, we started peaking 30,000. That was the first surge. July, 60,000. That's the second surge. The third surge, 250 to 300,000 January timeframe. And then we started getting things a bit better under control. And now it's starting to move up again. We're back to that 50, 60,000 range. And so that gets to the point where you see these states opening up, these states reducing their mandates, people crowding beaches, and you know that's going to drive cases up. That gets very disheartening because you are doing what you can to try and help fight this. Everybody in this country is doing what they can. We just need to do it a little more for a little longer period of time to get through this pandemic, Allison, and that's the key here.
Dr. John, when you look at that graph, too, it's so startling because so many of us think of the start of this pandemic as that terrifying time when none of us knew what was going on. People were afraid. People were dying. And you look at that spike, though, in January and February. Oh, my God. I mean, we forget how bad it was just a matter of weeks ago. It's absolutely wild. I know we certainly don't want to get back there again. I know that vaccines are going to be a big factor in preventing that. President Biden announcing today that 90% of adults will be eligible to get the vaccine in the next few weeks. Here he is.
By April 19th, 3 weeks from today, 90% of adults, people over 18 and over, will be eligible to get vaccinated. 90% of all Americans will be living within 5 miles of a place they can get a shot.
So that's great news over the next few weeks. But at the same time, states like Arkansas letting their mask mandate expire. What do you want to see on the vaccination front before more states start lifting their safety protocol?
And Allison, what I want to see is I want to see us get close to that herd immunity because we're not even that close to it right now. If you look at the amount of people that have been vaccinated, fully vaccinated, we're talking a little over 15% of the country. We need that 70% range to get people to get to that herd immunity point. And that's the point we can start rolling back on things. We can start taking these baby steps to open things up again. But to fully open up, to drop mask mandates universally across the country or across a state or a county in particular, that means that we're going to start seeing more cases again. And we don't want to do that. And you showed that chart earlier. I mean, who would think we'd look back at that first surge back in April timeframe and see 30,000 and say, wow, at that time we thought that was a lot. And then we fast forward to January, 300,000, 10 times that amount. We don't want to get back there, Allison, just like you said.
No, we certainly don't, Dr. John. We got some new data on the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. The CDC is saying they are 90% effective in a real-world study. You're the professional here. What does that mean? And how is it different from the efficacy data that we already had?
So, Allison, this is great news because it shows a couple of things. One, it's 90% effective at reducing infections. And they look both at asymptomatic, meaning people who are infected but didn't have symptoms. Those are the ones that can spread it to other people without knowing it. And then symptomatic, those that actually get COVID, the disease, and start having symptoms. 90% effective. Compare that to 94 to 95% effective in the human trials. The human trials are very controlled, and they look at people in certain situations. Here, it was over 3,000 people, and these were essential workers. Oftentimes, they were frontline frontline medical workers. They were people out there on the streets taking care of other people. And so these are people who are at highest risk. And for them to have that 90% and possibly more importantly, to not have that asymptomatic ability to spread it to other people is extremely important. That's the news we need to say, okay, we're doing the right thing. We're moving forward with this. And we need to make sure that more people get vaccinated. And that's the key, Allison, people just stepping up for that vaccine.
Hey, I become eligible in New York tomorrow. Dr. John, I absolutely can't wait. Dying to become one of those statistics of folks who are fully vaccinated. Thank you so much for all the encouragement and advice, helping all of us to get there.
You bet.
Rapper Lil Nas X had a hell of a weekend, releasing a limited line of 666 Satan shoes, custom Nike sneakers that have a drop of human blood in them. Nike now suing Mischief Product Studio for copyright infringement over those sneakers. NBCNews.com reporter Doa Madani joins me now. Doa, my first thought this weekend was, wow, a Satan shoe, that is pretty bold even for Nike. But now the company's saying in a statement it had nothing to do with the shoes, and Nike's suing for copyright infringement. What else are we hearing from Nike today? What's going on here?
Well, yeah, Nike told me yesterday they have nothing to do with this. And today they're suing for trademark infringement. They say that this damages their brand, that it dilutes their brand, and people are confused and calling for boycotts over Nike because Lil Nas X released the shoe with Mischief, which is a separate company. It's a kind of very popular in streetwear to have these customized shoes. It adds like a nice exclusive element. It's very cool. So it's totally separate from Nike.
Lil Nas X released those sneakers along with a new video that now has 34 million views. We know the sneakers sold out in less than a minute. But of course, there's a lot of controversy here. Pastor Mark Burns tweeting, "This is evil and heresy." Could you tell us a little bit more about the shoes and the reaction that they are getting?
Yeah. So as you can see, the shoes are they've got a pentagram on top. They've got a reference to Luke 10:18, which is a Bible verse about the Satan falling from heaven. And it's got blood in its soul. It's red ink mixed with a drop of human blood. Mischief confirmed to me that it's actually blood from their own team yesterday. And it was announced over Palm Sunday weekend. This is a really holy week for many, many people across the world. So it is something that people are kind of in an uproar about. They're pretty upset about it. I think Candace Owens called it immoral. There was a pastor who called Lil Nas a thug in his sermon yesterday. People are really upset over this. And, you know, it is something that is a part of their religious views. But the music video that you're referencing used a lot of biblical imagery to kind of make a metaphor for Lil Nas X's coming out story and the idea that he was taught homosexuality was a sin and choosing to fall from heaven because he wanted to live as who he was.
I have to say, all the religious controversy aside, I'm also just grossed out about a pair of shoes with someone else's blood, but that's me. What is Lil Nas X saying about all of this today? Is backing himself up, defending his choice? What are we hearing?
He's standing up for himself. He's been tweeting. He said yesterday on Twitter that the shoes are hard. You can't sit here and deny that the shoes are hard. He has been tweeting that he's been planning this for months. And he also kind of tweeted a SpongeBob clip today after the news of the lawsuit with Squidward saying, you guys, I was joking. So, he's just been tweeting. So follow his Twitter for more.
And hey, look, anyone who says no publicity is bad publicity, he's certainly getting a lot of attention today. Doa, great to have you on. This is a story we've all been talking about this weekend and today. Very cool to talk to you about it. Appreciate it.
Very cool to be on. Have a good one.
You too. The Suez Canal back in business. That giant container ship blocking canal traffic for nearly a week finally freed today and sent on its way. The vital trade route open again. Here's NBC News global correspondent Rafael Sanchez.
Alison, we spent all morning on the western bank of the Suez Canal just staring at that giant container ship, and it really didn't look like very much was happening. But then suddenly, in the afternoon, it lurched from standing still into movement, and in a pretty short period of time, about half an hour or so, it just sailed right past us with horns blaring in celebration, finally continuing its long-delayed journey up the Suez Canal. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi of Egypt says the crisis is over and the canal is open once again. As for the Ever Given itself, it's going north to the Bitter Lakes region, where it's going to be assessed for any damage it may have suffered over the last week. The absolute last thing Egypt wants is for this ship to break down a second time. So the blockage is clear, but this situation has caused untold chaos to the global shipping system. According to one estimate, $70 billion worth of goods has been delayed over the last week. Egypt has lost tens of millions of dollars in canal fee revenues, and you still have hundreds of ships snarled in this international traffic jam, waiting at both ends of the canal for their chance to finally go through. I will tell you, here in Egypt tonight, there is a sense of relief that this is over, and also a certain amount of pride that the Suez Canal, a major national symbol, is finally open to the world once again. Allison?
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.